He says that you can't use rationality to figure out everything. You can't arrive at every truth using rationality.
It's impossible to not have certain presumptions and biases. The whole notion of being unbiased is unreasonable. It's not possible.
Therefore, follow my flawed methodology instead. Using your senses, your eyes, your ears, they are biased and they're not reliable. But what's the alternative? Believing that other people saw and heard things a long time ago. So you're using the same thing except with extra steps and more bullshit. Like, how is that better? It's flabbergasting. He says you can't trust your ears and eyes, but I can trust the ears and eyes of men who existed 1,500 years ago and who participated in human trafficking. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Apostate Aladdin. I'm also joined by a friend of the channel, Theo Critic. Welcome, Theo.
Hi, thank you.
And by the way, thank you, Theo, for preparing, the interesting timestamps and for going through this. Today, we will be continuing the series of dissecting apologetics. And today's video is by Yasir Quadhi, a person who I've covered multiple times on this channel. And the question in focus here is everyone born a Muslim? Because if you're not aware, there is this concept in Islam that everyone is born on the fitrah, born on this default state of being a Muslim. And then they're taught something or another by their environment and their family and so on. And then they become some other religion or no religion. Obviously, I don't think that is true, but we want to hear from Yasir Quadhi what he thinks and how he explains that.
The problem is as follows. Most of us are Muslims, factually speaking, because we're born into a Muslim family. That's just a fact.
I'm happy to acknowledge that I'm happy that he's acknowledging this fact because I've spoken to a lot of Muslims who say, well, if I wasn't born a Muslim, I would find my way to Islam and I would be a Muslim. But he is acknowledging that most Muslims are Muslim because they were born Muslim.
There's an undeniable reality that people, by and large, follow the faith of their families. Now, we are not the first to mention this. In fact, of the first people to make this a core point of their philosophy is somebody who is considered to be the father of modern Western philosophy, René Descartes. And Descartes died 1650. Descartes is considered by and large to be the primary intellectual founder of the modern school of Western philosophy. And Descartes, obviously you all remember, you should know from your high school, from your college classes, Descartes has this famous quote, I think therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am.
But yeah, I guess it's worth reminding the viewers that just because somebody name drops something or someone or a concept doesn't mean that they're actually engaging with that idea or that the rest of their ideas are therefore on the same degree of validity or notoriety or something of that sort.
Descartes is problematizing inherited knowledge. How do you know anything? Because everything that you think you know can be challenged. So Descartes begins with the premise of radical skepticism. Even things I look at, my vision can be incorrect. And he gives the classic example of a pencil being put into the water and you see the pencil bent. You clearly see it. It's not straight, but you know it is straight. And he's like, I'm doubting my senses even. How do I even know anything? In fact, how do I even know I exist? My philosophy teacher 30 years ago, she basically said, what if you actually don't exist and your brain is simply in a vat and it's just electrodes being put in and the world as you know it is being programmed into your brain? For those of you who are not familiar with that idea, I can give you another one that you should all be familiar with, and that is the Matrix trilogy. In all likelihood, Descartes seems to have gotten this type of notion and the whiff of this type of thought from Al-Ghazali's Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. Al-Ghazali has a famous book, Deliverance from Error. If you read Al-Ghazali's Deliverance from Error, you actually really find a very similar overlap to Descartes' radical skepticism. And Al-Ghazali writes that I observed around me, and I noticed that the children of Christians always grow up to become Christians, and the children of Jews grow up to be Jews, and the children of Muslims grow up to be Muslims. So it is the influence of education and upbringing that determines their religion. Therefore, I realized that the truth of a belief cannot rest on mere blind following of your ancestors. This is Al-Ghazali, who is observing the world and saying, you know what, if I look around, Muslims predominantly are Muslim because their parents are Muslim, and vice versa, and Halumma Jarra, or all the other examples as well. Descartes says one must begin life by making a clean sweep of all opinions that one has received and to begin again from the base foundation in order to establish a firm and lasting knowledge. Even amongst those who have never lost their faith, it is evident that not all have built their faith from rational foundations, but in fact, most people accept faith because it was the faith they were brought up in. We now get to one of the fundamental problems that we have to solve when we come to the notion of how do we know Islam to be true. And that problem is we are all beginning our journey with inherent biases. And that is we're already Muslim. We are not attempting to solve this problem from a clean slate. Every one of us in this room is a believing Muslim. And we are approaching this problem as believers. So are we not kind of sort of presupposing the answer even before we begin to find?
I love this. This seems like a moment of lucidity, a moment of honesty. I don't know if it's going to follow up that way and continue that way, but I just want to acknowledge this is important. Starting with acknowledging that of course we believe in it because we were born into it. We have to start from a blank slate and assume that it's not true, that if we weren't born into it, what would we think?
We already have the answer, and we're pretending that we're going to try to find the solution. And people like Descartes, people like Ghazali, they are pointing out this contradiction, that it's not just Muslims who have this problem. Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, Jews, every single person of faith is inherently believing in their faith and then attempting to believe that or trying to prove that their faith is correct. So both Descartes and Ghazali then adopt what is called radical skepticism. And that skepticism is the assumption that you begin with a clean slate, the assumption that you negate everything and you begin your inquiry as if you are neutral. And then you build from neutrality. You build from from a clean piece of paper. Now you start writing your presumptions and then see where this leads. Now, theoretically, that sounds great.
So what he's saying is that you may be born with certain things, but you have to start with a clean slate. You have to throw all of that away. This is not Yasir Qadhi's thought. This is not his position. He's quoting Al-Ghazali and Descartes. I just want to point out that Yasir Quadhi has a degree in philosophy from Yale University. It's one of the most prestigious universities. He has a master's degree in philosophy, right? And this is a really important philosophical concept. He's calling it radical skepticism, but it's just skepticism. Like, it's just basic, don't assume what you're told is real. Question what your assumptions are.
I guess what would make it radical is if you start with, do I exist? Well, let's hear what he has to say about radical skepticism.
I do respect him a lot. I politely disagree with this enterprise, with this methodology, for many reasons.
Okay, so he doesn't agree with that.
Not at all. That was it. That was all.
I gave him a lot of credit earlier for saying, hey, at least he acknowledges that we have to start from a neutral ground. But no,
he doesn't.
He doesn't. But let's hear why. Maybe he has a point. Maybe I'm missing something. Why does he disagree?
Well, why don't I ask you? What is problematic with the notion of beginning by skepticism, beginning with a blank slate? What would be problematic? As a Muslim, what is problematic? Tell me.
Hold on. I want to say something here. What he's doing right now is not what it looks like. What it looks like is that he is engaging the audience, right? He's in a class, and it looks like that he is trying to entice
participants. Question for people to participate, but obviously he's not. Yeah,
that's not what he's doing. My background is business, right? And part of that business and marketing and in personal selling, I think it's called trial close. Get the customer to say what they would do with the car if they owned it. He's trying to get his audience to say it so that they're more sold on it.
Yeah, he's not saying, do you think this is unreasonable? He says, it is unreasonable. As Muslims, tell me why. Or like,
yes.
Yeah, but this seems to be a common theme. Aside from what you mentioned, a lot of sheikhs have this down very well, where they would ask you a question just to get you to fill in a word or even to nod along, and then they continue. Yeah, I agree. It is a bit of a manipulation technique.
The notion of beginning by skepticism, beginning with a blank slate. What would be problematic? As a Muslim, what is problematic? Tell me.
Okay, as a Muslim, it's sort of circular, even the way that he poses this.
Yes. There is no clean slate. Okay, we're getting there. You're getting there. Yes. It opens the door to kufr. How so? Yeah, so to begin your journey by a blank slate basically means you will have to doubt the existence of God. You will have to doubt the truth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You will have to doubt everything. And then, is that what Islam wants us to do? I mean, quote.
Okay. I have to pause here. He says what? I disagree with this position of radical skepticism. And I think I disagree as a scholar, as a learned person who studied philosophy. That's what I'm thinking he's saying. But no, he's saying I disagree as a believer because it threatens my beliefs. I am so disappointed. I understand now why you said Theo. Theo had watched this video. I hadn't watched it before, and he told me I'm so disappointed in Yasir Quadhi. I guess I'm kind of used to it at this point. But yeah, so he says I disagree fundamentally with radical skepticism because I'm a believer and it threatens my beliefs, because I would have to doubt the prophecy of Muhammad and that Allah is real and so on. That's not a good reason.
Me one passage in the Quran where Allah says, doubt me. Quote me one passage where Allah says, let's begin this journey with a clean slate by rejecting the Prophet and then proving him. That's very problematic if you go that route. What's another problem? Let's keep on going. Another problem. Yes. Removing the source of information and prioritizing what then? What are we prioritizing when we remove other information? What would be our source of information? Reason. Intellect.
Okay, so that's why he quoted Descartes earlier, is to say, we can't trust our senses. He's kind of bringing up the conversation to say our senses are unreliable. And if you practice radical skepticism, you're relying on your senses instead of the word of God. Also your intellect, as he says. But that premise is so flawed. I've long made this a point to highlight that when someone says, do you think you're smarter than God? Or do you think you have the ability to understand God's cognitive abilities? You're not like, that's not the correct question to ask, because the person who's practicing skepticism or thinking, in other words, if you're critically thinking, you're not claiming you know more than God. You are challenging this claim of God, not God itself if it exists. So he's saying, do you trust your intellect more than you trust God? Well, first prove that God does exist, not just a God, but that God does exist.
And this raises a very big problem, which we're going to come to later on. But Descartes, remember, this is now 15th century, right? This is 600 years ago. This is the beginning of the Enlightenment. And guys, I'm giving you a crash course in Western philosophy as well, because that's what we need to do.
No, he isn't.
Yeah.
He just really isn't.
Name dropping one philosopher and one concept does not mean that you're giving a crash course on Western philosophy or whatever.
Descartes is the beginning, the founder of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment assumed that the mind is capable of achieving ultimate truth. That's the basic premise of Enlightenment philosophy.
Pause here for a
Theo,
second.
I'm not as well read on philosophy or enough to say if I agree or disagree with this, if this is factual, but is what he's saying true?
I don't know specifically about whether Descartes was the starting point of the Enlightenment. What's really important to understand over here is that every apologist has an incentive to undermine Enlightenment. Europe, 500 years ago, was a lot like the Muslim world, Islamic world is today, which was like every country was, run by some sort of theocracy, right? Like the kings were divinely appointed. The Enlightenment philosophy, it's what triggered the change in the thinking process of Europe and brought Europe into a secularism. Right. So it behooves him, if he's going to quote an Enlightenment philosopher, to also undermine Enlightenment in this. Otherwise, he undermines his whole argument, his whole position.
But yeah, he says skepticism is bad because it would make me question my beliefs.
This is so infuriating because this guy has a master's degree from one of the most prestigious schools in the world. Circular reasoning, straw manning, like all the things that he's doing is what you learn in the first philosophy class in first semester. It's called critical thinking. It's philosophy 101. I'm not a philosophy major. I don't have a degree in philosophy. I don't even have a minor in philosophy. I took it, I'm the same age as him, so I took it basically the same time as he did, 30 years ago, whatever. And it is like so obvious to me that the stuff that he's doing from a philosophy academics point of view is like a doctor not knowing what a blood vessel is. Like it's really lame.
I am not, as well versed in philosophy as many people out there. I've taken, 1 or 2 courses, and even I can tell, that this is not right. And you don't need to be a philosopher to not let the weight of his degrees and his education fool you. Listen to his actual words. So even without a philosophy background, you can tell that this is not adding up.
If I just think rationally, I'll solve all the problems. Well, by and large, a lot of people don't believe them. Hardly any active philosopher believes this now, because we've now moved on to post-Enlightenment, post-rationalism, post-modernism, in which we realize there is no such thing as neutrality. There is no such thing as unbiasedness.
I don't follow what he's saying here. He's saying even, philosophers now agree there is no such thing as neutral. You're always biased. Therefore, I'm going to be blatantly biased right in your face, and there's nothing you could do about it.
Yeah, like there's a fine line between I acknowledge that there's no such thing as bias, so we have to work extra hard and be extra aware of our biases that are being smuggled in subconsciously, perhaps. That's one thing. And what he's saying is it is impossible to come from therefore it's impossible to come from a neutral position. Neutrality and unbiasedness are not the same thing. Like if I was on a jury and there was somebody who was accused of murder, I can withhold my judgment. I can hold myself to a standard of neutrality until I hear all the evidence, and then go with the evidence whilst still acknowledging that I have biases.
It's like how he says that you can't use rationality to figure out everything. You can't arrive at every truth using rationality. Therefore, follow my flawed methodology instead, which is far from any sort of skepticism whatsoever.
It's impossible to not have certain presumptions and biases. The whole notion of being unbiased is unreasonable. It's not possible. You just can't have, you can try to be less biased, you can try to have less presuppositions, but at the end of the day, you're human, you're not God.
Wait, before we get into that, so he says using your senses, your eyes, your ears, that's, it's impossible not to use them, and they are biased and they're not reliable. I'm with you. It's not an objective measure of anything. But what's the alternative? Believing that other people saw and heard things a long time ago. So you're using the same thing except with extra steps and more bullshit. Like, how is that better? It's flabbergasting. He says you can't trust your ears and eyes, but I could trust the ears and eyes of men who existed 1,500 years ago and who participated in human trafficking. Does that make it a more trustworthy method?
Another problem comes, the presupposition that I need to examine every single faith to prove which one is right. How long would that take? How long would it take for an average person to study all the faiths of the world and come to a conclusion?
That is an excellent point, but not in the way that he thinks he's making it. Let's work again. We have to try to have some extent of neutrality here. Say for example, Christianity is the truth, just for the sake of the argument here. And as a Muslim, you don't go through the effort of looking into Christianity because I don't have the time to look into every religion. Does that mean that Christianity is false just because you're too busy? This is a point against God, because if God expects you to sift through every religion, especially if you're not born into a Muslim family, and if Islam is way far down the list, or Islam is unappealing, or Islam doesn't make sense and you skip to the next one, then you go to hell forever. Like, isn't that a point against God and this flawed method that he expects us to use?
That's a good point. I never thought of that. But like he's basically making an argument against God's logic here. Like, I'm creating you with finite capabilities and all sorts of constraints, and then in that you have to figure out what the ultimate truth is. Oh, spoiler, you don't have time for that. And then you still get punished for letting on the wrong answer.
But he says it's too hard to look at every single faith. Therefore, just follow the one that your parents were born in.
Therefore, Islam is correct. Like, how do you get to that?
Yeah. Therefore, we can dismiss Islam as one of the many religions that we don't have time to look into. Like if that's the logic here.
You would spend years, if not decades. And in reality, how many people have not just the time, but the intellectual acumen to study all the faith traditions?
That is an excellent point. Again, not in the way that he's using it, because I've always struggled with this belief in Islam that Islam is so self-evident. If you are of sound mind and you inspect Islam honestly, as they say, without hatred and all that, an open heart and all that kind of stuff, it logically follows. It is impossible to conclude anything but that Islam is true. But then he just says, it's wrong to assume that everyone has the intellect and the acumen. Is that what he says?
Yeah.
To go through these religions and assess whether they make sense or not. So how do you expect people to do it for the one true religion? Why did God make it that way? Some people don't have the ability to think that critically. Is that their fault that they're going to hell because they weren't smart enough to find your book compelling? This argument doesn't make any sense.
You and I spend a lot of time thinking about this and unpacking this. Huge investment of our time. Right? Not everybody has that time. Not everybody can do that. It's a skill. It's a time investment. On one hand, he acknowledges that, and on the other hand, he says, "I don't even know how to finish that sentence. Therefore, don't bother. Therefore, take my word for it.
Therefore, trust me, bro."
It doesn't make any sense to do this, neither rationally, nor logistically, nor even from the Quranic texts. So in reality, the notion of beginning with a blank slate and then trying to prove Islam completely neutrally doesn't add up from any sense. But then the problem comes, well, then what is the alternative? Because factually speaking, look around you, the vast majority of people who follow any faith tradition happen to have been born into it, and we are no exception in this room.
He's so close to the self-awareness. He's so close.
So how do we solve this paradox? If a Hindu says, my faith, this tradition is correct, because obviously it's totally rational, logical to me, and a Christian says the same thing, and a Muslim says the same thing, and each one is saying, oh, but I examined everything, and it seems all correct to me. And how would you then go about disproving the claims of other faith traditions and proving your own? In fact, it doesn't seem fair. In fact, to be brutally honest, how would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala require the average human being to sift through this entire mess of a spectrum of opinions and theologies before arriving at the right one?
Exactly. I want to know how he answers that, how he resolves that.
And here is where we begin our solution to this intellectual paradox. And the beauty is that this solution is Quranic and Hadithic. It is directly in the Quran and Sunnah, and it predates the paradox formulation.
What do you mean predates? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, it predates it, therefore it's correct. I don't get it. I don't get that.
Also, it doesn't, how many religions have existed before Islam? How did this predate the paradox? What? What?
I don't understand this. This logic is so absurd.
This is not even a paradox. The paradox is for believers, right? Because their God says, or their God implies, or their religion implies, you need to be smart enough and you need to follow this method. But practically speaking, you can't follow this method, and everyone else from other religions also follow this method and arrive at different conclusions. That's the paradox. It's not a paradox for you and me. It's a paradox for him because he believes two things at the same time. That God could say no wrong, but also God said something that's impractical and impossible to follow. And it's kind of a black hole that every religious person can fall into regardless of what their religion is. It's a trap. That is the paradox for them.
The solution is inherent in our tradition, even though the intellectual paradox was verbalized by mankind fairly recently. Because the solution is inherent within it. And that solution, which one of the sisters brought up, is the existence of a precondition embedded in us equally as human beings that doesn't require external knowledge.
That is also a claim from the religion. You can't do that. Bro, you can't do that. How did he graduate? Yale should call him right now and revoke their degree, because what the hell are you talking about? We have a solution for this paradox that our God or our religion created, which is some bullshit that we claim, that we're all born Muslim. That's essentially what he's saying.
The solution is a divine gift that solves the paradox. Without this divine gift, frankly, there is no solution to this paradox. If we didn't have this solution in the Quran and Sunnah, then honestly, we would be at an impasse. We would literally be stuck, because there's a valid argument to be made that, well then, we're just Muslims because we're born Muslims, and they're Christians because they're born Christians, and they're Jews because they're born Jews.
So if only these other traditions had also mentioned a silly clause saying, actually everyone is born Hindu, by the way, then they wouldn't, then Muslims would have nothing to say. You see how stupid this sounds? Because Islam is the only religion among those that has this clause that says, by the way, you're born Muslim even if you don't know it. There's also this belief that we all consented to be sent down to earth because God asked us, do you acknowledge that I'm real? Do you acknowledge that, all this stuff is real? And we said yes. And God said, so you want to go to earth and get tested? And we said yes. And then he wiped our memory. Sure. Sure, bro, that happened, and all the angels clapped. But like, if other religions were to say something similar and say everyone was born a Christian, actually, and then they stray away depending on how they're raised, what would Yasir Qadhi's argument be? It's silly to think that this is actually a good argument just because it happened in Islam to make another claim about how everyone's born Muslim.
I can't imagine anything more circular.
I would like to hear that brought up in Philosophy 101 even. The students, 19-year-olds would tear him to shreds for saying something like that, let alone other professors.
You're right. This is first-year stuff. It's so ridiculous.
But there's one aspect that changes the entire game, and the only faith tradition that brings it.
Notice that the way that he talks is very important in presenting what he's saying as true. Or as something that you need to learn, or you need to accept this. That's the point of live streams like this, is to focus on the words, not how good or bad of a presenter he is. Is what he's saying true?
The only tradition that has this interesting concept that predates the formulation of the paradox is the Quran. And that is the solution of the human fitrah, which is explicitly linked to the religion of Islam.
What Yasir is saying is, because Islam mentions and claims the concept of fitrah, which is that everyone is born by default a Muslim with a blank slate, which is Islam, therefore we could just ignore this paradox that he brought up. We can ignore the fact that it is kind of blinding to be born into a religion and then try to look at it critically and just accept it because, the religion says I was not just born a Muslim because I was a Muslim. Everyone's born a Muslim. Therefore, that fixes everything.
I want to point out one more thing. He, for whatever reason, emphasized that it's unique to Islam. It's amazing how many different religions claim that kind of thing. Like, Christianity is the only religion where God became flesh. Why does that matter?
That's an excellent point. I keep reminding people often that one of the methods that a lot of these religious apologists use is highlight what is unique to the religion and make that a criteria for the truth somehow. Like, for example, I've heard in Christianity that there's a lot of cross-referencing in the Bible. Great. Does that prove that the Bible is therefore inspired by God? No, it doesn't. But they choose to focus on a feature or an idea or whatever that is unique to them so that they can say, no other religion has this, therefore we have the truth. Whether it's true or not that no other religion has thought to say, actually everyone was born, insert religion here, doesn't actually mean that therefore Islam is true. It just means you have this concept that in one of the large surviving religions is unique. I'll give you an example. Say I'm an investment banker, right? And I say my portfolio or my investment choices or method is unique because I am the only person who does his investments on the toilet seat.
Right.
Forget how well they perform or how poorly they perform. I'm the only one who does it that way. What does that mean? Like, does that mean that therefore I am the best, or that therefore I'm a good investment banker, or my methodology is good? No, it doesn't mean anything.
So the human fitrah explicitly affirms the existence of a divinely gifted, innately placed faculty. It is divinely gifted, equally to all human beings, not just the Muslims. Not just the Muslims. It's not just Muslims that have it, because otherwise it would not be fair. Every human has it, regardless of faith. And because every human has it, every human is equally capable of accessing it. And that is the notion of the divine predisposition that is innate in the soul of every single human being.
It's a notion, claim, whatever. It's not a fact. And he hasn't began to demonstrate like any sort of, forget studies, any sort of anecdotes even about how people are born Muslim, even if they have no Islamic education. Like they're just born innately Muslim.
It's called the fitrah. Really, without a doubt, this is the most obvious answer. How do we know Islam to be true? Before we go anywhere else, the fitrah. That is the number one response, the fitrah.
What does fitrah mean? I'm not from Arabic background, so.
It's an Islamic word. I don't know if it's used outside of Islam really, but it essentially means like your innate state or your innate, I guess our fitrah collectively as humans, or at least most humans, our fitrah is that we are social creatures, for example.
Oh, okay. So you would say it's an aspect of human nature then?
Yeah, in a sense. Like it's something that's innate to us. Like cats by fitrah, not that, people speak that way about cats, but cats by fitrah know to cover their poop, for example.
Right.
Like it's sort of something that we're born with. And he says by fitrah, we are Muslim.
This is a little bit off topic, but like, doesn't that make God woefully ineffective?
In what sense?
Well, because the argument is that everybody's Muslim, right? The argument is that God made everybody innately with this quality of Muslimness. Now, if fitrah is analogous to human nature, right? You can see human nature playing out, like laughter, universal. You can find laughter in every corner of the world, regardless of whether they've been introduced to the Quran, right? You can find love, compassion, greed, hatred, all sorts of things. These are all different aspects of human nature. If Muslimness was innate to every human that is born, then shouldn't you have Muslims in the Papua New Guinea who had never interacted with Muslims? Shouldn't you have Muslims in the Inuit population? The exposure you have seems to be thousands of times more effective than God's fitrah.
Well, that's part of what they say, is that everyone's born Muslim by fitrah, but then people's conditioning and teachings, of those around them is what molds them into something else or into Muslims. But
Yeah.
essentially, that's like saying, 3 plus x equals 3, x equals 0.
Yeah.
X is nothing. Like if you replace Islam with, again, just an example, Hinduism, everyone is born a Hindu, and then molding them changes them into something else. It still applies exactly the same. Because a Muslim can be born a Hindu, but if their parents are not Hindu, then they're going to be, socialized into a Muslim. It means nothing.
Again, I want to drive this point home ever so slightly. You used the example earlier of a cat covering up its poop.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't have to teach the cat to do that. I believe that there's a stronger argument that cats covering up their poop is fitrah, like in the sense that it seems to mean in Yasir Quadhi's argument, than the fact that we know that God, Allah, is the true God, because it should be like that, like widespread. You didn't have to teach the cats, and it's regardless of where they are. In Argentina, in Lithuania, cats will cover up their poo. But you don't find the same results with people believing in Allah.
To your point, lately I've been reading a little bit into developmental psychology, like little children, and there are many aspects that if the scientists were to do a study on children who are young enough, toddlers, the results would be the same in the U.S., in Saudi Arabia, in Indonesia. Right. Because it's not yet, they haven't been socialized. They don't have the ability to gain a lot of influence. So that is something that is innate, and these things can be studied, and there's a lot of commonalities. That's not the case with Islam. If you do studies all over the world, you're not going to find Muslim babies everywhere. Right. There's no way to actually measure it. That's, lucky Yasir Quadhi. But even if you could, there's no commonality in their Muslim beliefs. This whole premise is coming from someone who believes in souls, not in biology, right? And believes that your soul that you're born with has the same capability as a fully functioning brain, which is not the case. A baby, a newborn baby, does not have the cognitive ability to hold a belief like that at all. So what are we even talking about?
So Islam believes that there is a soul. That soul is somehow like a coherent adult mind, right, that is capable of grasping these things. It enters into a contract that if a 7-year-old entered into a contract in our reality, it would be invalid.
Just to get ahead of the comments that would say, well, in Islam, if you die before you hit puberty, you're not accountable or something like that.
That just feeds into my point. You're not accountable, as you said, before the age of puberty, but at the age of minus X, you enter into a contract, and that it's supposed to be held against you for things the mind has not been able to wrap your head around. This is beyond disjointed and absurd.
I don't know why it took me so long to think about how stupid this sounds. I mean, as I've just been thinking about it the whole time philosophically, and how can you prove it? What's the argument? All that kind of stuff. But it's a stupid idea because the baby cannot physically think. It doesn't have the complexity. It doesn't have all the wrinkles, all the brain parts yet. The brain doesn't even finish developing, the prefrontal cortex, for example, to the 20s. But a baby is born Muslim. How? That means nothing. But to answer why that means something, because a Muslim believes that a baby is born with a soul that is in a sense the same person that the 20-year-old will be. The same person. But that's not a fact. Who you are as a baby and who you are as a 20-year-old are worlds apart and could change based on so many factors, right? Where you're born and all that, and how your life goes. So to say that you're born as a Muslim baby is meaningless, even if that was true, which is unfalsifiable and not true, it's bullshit. But even if it were, it means nothing.
So going back to how effective God is, monotheism is very new. It started right around Jesus's time. Prior to that, throughout history, there was no monotheism. There was always polytheism, and it is quite universal. If Hanifa is part of Fitrah, if monotheism is part of this innate sense that we're supposed to have, that didn't work for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. God has been completely ineffectual. Islamic monotheism is linked to Christianity. Christian monotheism is linked to Judaism. Right. In the same way as, let's say, for example, rock music is linked to a previous variation of, it follows one lineage. If Fitrah was true, you should have many instantiations of monotheism that are unrelated and unconnected to each other. Fitrah just doesn't support monotheism based on his own argument.
Second point, what does linguistically the fitrah mean? So we quoted the verse. It's clear in the Quran that Allah is saying there's something that an-nas, mankind, has been gifted. And Allah has fatara an-nas. Fatara means to cleave open and implant. That's what fatara means. And that's why Allah is called Fatir as-samawati wal-ard, the one who cleft open, the one who created the heavens and earth. So fatara means that you literally break asunder. Something was there, you cracked it open basically, right? That's what fatara means. So something has been put inside. And that is the concept of fitrah.
Is that what he's saying? Allah opened up our soul before we were born and inserted this idea, implanted this idea?
He's mentioning facts about the word fitrah as if all of it leads to something.
Right.
There's another mention of how God fatara as-sama or something, God opened up the sky or the earth. I can't remember which one. So he's saying the root word also like can be used differently to mean open. Therefore, it also proves that God opened you up and put the fitrah inside you. What the fuck? Like, how does that prove anything?
I mean, if anything, this could be the etymological fallacy.
It's insane. Like, he can mention etymology and mention that it's interesting, that it also means like, or in other contexts, in other ways, could mean opening up. So God is opening you up to the truth, and that is interesting. But it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't actually prove it. He says that's a linguistic proof. Do Muslim preachers understand what the word proof means? That's a linguistic factoid.
Yeah.
That's a fun fact. It's not a proof.
And language is descriptive anyway. Like, its definitions don't prove things.
He sounds like he's high and just being like, whoa, man, isn't it crazy? That also means open up. Like Allah opened up Muhammad's chest and put like virtue and faith in his heart. Whoa. There's a comment that I want to highlight, by the way, because it was so funny. TM says, Yasir Quadhi studied philosophy to join the war on fallacies on the side of the fallacies. That's,
Yes.
yeah.
Well said.
There were stages in his career as a Muslim speaker and scholar where he seemed to display a degree of doubt or critical thinking or acknowledgement that the standard narrative has holes. So that's something that he said at some point. And because he got dunked on so hard, I think he kind of recoiled into his shell and found a way to make sense of things again, despite having a moment of lucidity maybe, or learning so much. I don't know. I can't possibly psychoanalyze him, and I'm not going to try to. It's just fascinating that he has the knowledge, or has a degree that certifies that he at some point acquired the knowledge, or did exams that should certify that he has that knowledge, and yet has not learned it.